All right, now let's switch gears slightly and talk about accessible route or path of travel. Most commonly, this is referred to as the path of travel. Different than ramps, and the biggest thing about the path of travel is it's generally not, I'm going to go back a slide here. It's generally not like getting into the building. It's not getting in the front door. It's getting from the parking lot to the front of the building. It's getting from the bus stop to the front of the building. It's getting across the street, okay? It's getting through an area, okay? There has to be a path of travel. Around College of the Redwoods, there's a dedicated path of travel all the way around the campus so that every part of campus is accessible. And so we'll talk about some of those criteria right now, okay? All right. Same thing as the ramps. You can't exceed 2% cross slope. And this is cross slope right here, okay? This is one of the biggest ones, and this is, I would say, the thing that ends up with sidewalks getting jackhammered out the most is that cross slope being in excess. One of the tricky parts about this when you're pouring concrete is the LSA, the licensed state architect, is going to use a 2-foot level to check this. Okay, so maybe if you're pouring a 6-foot sidewalk and from one end to the other, if you put a 6-foot 2x4 on that and then set your level on top of that, maybe you're under 2% in that regard. But if you put a 2-foot level anywhere on the sidewalk and it's not completely flat, you're going to find some places that exceed 2%. And then it's going to fail, okay? This picture says minimum 3-foot width. Again, that's a federal guideline in the state of California. The minimum is 4 feet, okay? We can't exceed 5% with our path of travel, with our accessible route. As soon as we exceed 5%, it becomes a ramp. Okay, that being said, there is a little bit of wiggle room if the area you're trying to pour a sidewalk is in excess of 5% anyway. Okay, so if the street exceeds 5%, you can't make a sidewalk that is less than 5%. Okay, your sidewalk would just go into a hole essentially, or go up a mountain or something like that. Okay, so it can follow the contours of the street, but generally speaking, you're kind of bound by these guidelines. You can't have any height differences of more than 1/2 inch. It's common to see people have like spray painted these high edges of the sidewalk, but what you're really supposed to do, and what the city of Eureka at least is starting to crack down on, is making you come out here with a grinder and grind this down or potentially replace a square. They're actually going around and inspecting your sidewalk, okay, the public right-of-way around your house, if you've pulled a permit. And they'll kind of say, okay, as soon as you go over this amount of money in improvements, you need to bring all of this stuff into compliance. And so I'm going to be doing a project at my house pretty soon, and I'm going to have to cut out a couple squares of sidewalk around my house and replace those because I've got this kind of uplift happening. Okay. We've all probably seen these lines cut into the sidewalk. Those are required, okay? I forget exactly what they're called, but we have a special tool that has all these grooves in the bottom, and we have to cut these into the wet concrete at the grade change. Okay, so let's say we've got a sidewalk and then it drops down to a drop curb. At the top where it's still flat, we're going to cut these grooves in before that grade changes. And what these are actually for is for people with canes. So when they're feeling ahead, vision impaired people, when they're feeling ahead with their cane, they can feel these grooves in the sidewalk and they know the curb's about to drop down. okay? This is called a detectable warning mat, or the other name for it is a truncated dome, and it's a similar thing. This is for people with canes so that they know that they're about to go into the street, or you're supposed to have them at like railroad platforms and stuff, like don't walk any further, this is where the train is going to be, okay? So these are really, really common. They're there's not a great way to put these in. I remember when we first started putting these in, we were like gluing them to the concrete, and that lasted about 3 weeks, and then they started pulling up, and then we were drilling holes and screwing them down, but then water would get underneath them and they'd be all squishy, and there's just not a great way to do these. Now they're a lot more, originally they were kind of like rubber, and now they're a harder plastic and it's more rigid, and I think they have posts that you, like steel posts that are on the bottom that you cast into the concrete. All right, let's talk a little bit about entrance requirements. This is kind of a big one also. Like I said before, 60% of all entrances need to be accessible. At least one entrance on your building needs to be directly accessible from the parking lot, okay? Not every entrance needs to have a direct path of travel to a handicap stall, but at least one entrance on the building needs to. Doors have very specific requirements. You can't have more than 5 pounds of force used to operate the door, and it has to be a one-hand operation. They actually have devices to test how many pounds of force are required to open the door. Here's this number popping up again, 34 to 38. Okay, the door hardware, knob, lever, whatever the case may be, needs to be within 34 and 38 inches above the ground. There needs to be 32 inches clear of space, okay, between the jambs. Okay, and that's the minimum amount of space for a wheelchair to be able to pass through. On each side of the door, there needs to be maneuvering space so that somebody could turn around, maneuver a wheelchair, or whatever the situation is. But you can't open the door into like a brick planter or something like that. Okay, there needs to be space on either side. Bathrooms are one of the most regulated rooms. Okay, and this is kind of a nice chart that I have here, but one of the big things is you need to have clear space for maneuverability inside the bathroom. You need a space of 30 by 48 inches clear space. You need to have a 60-inch turning radius. Okay. There are a lot of height restrictions and requirements for accessories in the bathroom. So for example, mirrors, the bottom of the mirror has to be at 40 inches if it's over a counter. Okay, that's as high as it can be. If it's not over a counter, it can't be any more than 35 inches. The accessible stall, and remember we talked about every restroom has to be accessible, and then every restroom has to have one accessible stall. And so the accessible stall has a minimum requirement of a 60 by 60. You have to have grab bars inside that stall, and there's very specific guidelines for the height of those grab bars. There's guidelines for how high the toilet seat can be. It has to be between 17 and 19 inches. All right, this chart is showing how obstructed reach can change the maximum height for certain accessories in a bathroom. So generally speaking, any operable parts of accessories, soap dispensers, toilet paper dispensers, paper towel dispensers, have to be at least 18 inches above the finished floor and no more than 48 inches. If there is obstructed reach, for example, a countertop or something like that, that changes the maximum height. Okay, and you can't have any obstructed reach more than 11 inches. Okay, so here's an example here. So within a half an inch of obstruction, you can go up to 48 inches in height. Okay, so if you have a soap dispenser and it's located 48 inches above the floor, you can have up to a half an inch of something obstructing that reach. If you have 2 inches of depth that somebody has to reach over, all of a sudden that thing can only be 46 inches high. Okay, the max obstructed reach is 11 inches. So you could have 11 inches of depth in the way of somebody accessing an operable part, and all of a sudden the maximum height is now 34 inches. So hopefully you're all getting that there's a lot of moving parts with all of this, and depending on what you've got in the way, it's going to change those height requirements also. Okay, but generally, here's a couple bathroom requirements that are pretty common. Grab bars have to be between 33 and 36 inches. The lavatory height, and lavatory is a plumbing name for the bathroom sink, the height and countertop, bathroom sink countertop, but the maximum height is 34 inches. You have to have a knee clearance of 27 inches. Okay, so from the floor, there has to be 27 inches of clear space for someone in a wheelchair to roll up to the lavatory. Okay, and that has to be at least 8 inches deep. Any supply lines or waste lines or anything like that have to be insulated. And the reason is, or like wrapped in kind of like a non-thermally conductive material. And the reason is because people that don't have feeling in their legs, if they roll up to a sink and there's scalding hot water running through the drain, they could burn themselves. And so that has to be protected. This is a video that I want everybody to watch, and it was actually put out, it's kind of cool, it was put out by a local chamber of commerce explaining how easily you can make some very common upgrades at your place of business. And it's coming from the point of view of people with disabilities have money and they have the same rights as everybody else. And if you don't go terribly far out of your way and make some of these like basic accommodations and welcome people into your place of business, it makes financial sense. Whereas if you try and shut people out, you're not only going to miss out on that business, you're also going to potentially invite lawsuits. And so this just kind of goes over some pretty simple upgrades that you can make to bring your place of business into compliance. This video is about an accessible home, an entirely accessible home that this guy had built. And it's kind of neat, like seeing things from a different perspective and just having seeing how all the cabinets are lower and just everything has to be designed for someone in a wheelchair. And it's something I think that we all kind of take for granted. And so to wrap it all up, there is an awful lot of stuff in the Americans with Disabilities Act. What I wanted everybody to get out of this is mostly an awareness that if you're working on a project that's publicly funded, or if you're working on a project that is going to serve members of the public, there are accessibility requirements that are mandated by law that you have to meet. Okay? Primarily, they're dealing with egress in and out of the building, obstructions as you're maneuvering throughout the building. And those guidelines are going to vary depending on mostly like inside the bathroom if you're having to reach over something, but generally everything's accessible. Like you can find all these requirements. I put that obstructed reach chart in there because I wanted everybody to be aware that things could change depending on the situation. But the biggest thing is knowing what you're up against, knowing what you're dealing with when you're doing some of these projects. And this is an opportunity for work. Okay, this is something that has to happen in pretty much every building that's available to the public. Okay, everything that's not a private residence has to meet ADA guidelines. And so if you are familiar with these guidelines, if you're able to perform this work, if you're able to design plans that address this, then it can be potentially lucrative. And so I hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.